The mud-caked boots stumbled through the gates of the Anderson Homestead just as the first drops of autumn rain began to fall across Millbrook Valley. What James Anderson saw that evening would haunt him for weeks to come, not because it was horrific, but because it was heartbreakingly human. A young woman, her dress torn and stained with travel, her dark hair matted against her pale face, collapsed against his fence post like a broken bird seeking shelter from a storm that had already passed through her soul. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived 100 lifetimes of sorrow. When she looked up at him through the gathering dusk, her lips barely moved as she whispered those words that would echo in his memory forever. "Please, just kill me now." Her voice was so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind, but James Anderson had learned to listen for sounds others couldn't hear, words others wouldn't understand, pain others couldn't recognize. What happened next would transform not just two broken souls, but an entire community that had forgotten what it meant to hope. This is the story of how sometimes the most profound healing begins with the simplest act of refusing to give up on another human being, even when they've given up on themselves. Millbrook Valley had always been the kind of place where strangers stood out like wildflowers in a wheat field. Nestled between the rolling hills of eastern Colorado, the small farming community of Cedar Creek had perhaps 300 souls on its best day, and most of those folks had been born within 20 miles of where they now lived. The railroad had passed them by 5 years earlier, choosing to run its tracks through the larger settlement of Pinewood instead, leaving Cedar Creek to rely on wagon roads and the occasional traveling merchant for contact with the outside world. James Anderson had been different when he'd arrived 3 years prior, but different in a way that people could understand. He'd been a man with money enough to buy the old Henderson place, skills enough to make it profitable, and sense enough to mind his own business while lending a hand when neighbors needed it. The townspeople had accepted him gradually, the way a cautious cat eventually accepts a new presence in its territory. They didn't ask too many questions about his past, and he didn't volunteer information about where he'd learned to set bones with the precision of a trained physician or why he sometimes woke his nearest neighbors with nightmares that echoed across the prairie wind. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the only formally trained medical man within 50 miles, had been the first to notice something unusual about their newest resident. When young Danny O'Brien had broken his leg in a fall from the Anderson barn, James had stabilized the injury with a competence that spoke of extensive experience with trauma. His hands had moved with the steady confidence of someone who had dealt with far worse injuries under far worse conditions. When Hayes had complimented his field medicine, James had simply nodded and changed the subject to the weather. Mary Chun, whose family had established a general store after arriving from San Francisco during the mining boom, possessed the keen observational skills that came from years of reading people across language barriers. She noticed how James always positioned himself with his back to a wall when he came into the store, how his eyes would scan every face and exit, how he carried himself with a coiled alertness that spoke of someone who had lived in dangerous places. Yet he was unfailingly polite, always paid his bills promptly, and had never once raised his voice or shown impatience with her slower English or her elderly father's inability to remember prices. The Anderson homestead itself told its own story to those who knew how to read the signs. What appeared to be simple ranch improvements to most folks looked different to Sheriff William Tucker, who had served in the cavalry before taking up the badge. The placement of the buildings, the sight lines from the house to the main road, the way certain fence posts were positioned to provide cover while maintaining clear fields of fire, all suggested that James Anderson was a man who understood tactical thinking. Yet Tucker had never seen him wear a gun, and his only weapon seemed to be a hunting rifle and a shotgun, both well-maintained but unremarkable. Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who rode a circuit between Cedar Creek and 3 other small communities, had perhaps come closest to understanding the depths of James Anderson's character. During the terrible influenza outbreak the previous winter, when Dr. Hayes had been overwhelmed and 3 families had already lost members to the disease, James had appeared at the church one morning carrying a leather satchel filled with medical supplies that weren't available anywhere in the county. He'd worked for 72 hours straight, moving from house to house with a tireless dedication that had saved at least a dozen lives. Father Santos had watched him sit with the dying, holding their hands and speaking quietly in languages the priest didn't recognize, offering comfort that transcended words. When it was over, James had simply packed his supplies and returned to his ranch without accepting thanks or payment. The priest had tried to engage him in conversation about faith and service, but James had deflected with the same gentle firmness he applied to all personal inquiries. Emma Rodriguez, the schoolteacher who had arrived from Denver the year before, had formed her own theories about James Anderson. She'd observed how he interacted with the children when they occasionally wandered onto his property chasing stray livestock or lost balls. He was patient and kind, but there was something in his manner that suggested he understood childhood trauma in ways that went beyond normal adult experience. When 10-year-old Sally Tucker had gone missing for an entire night, James had been the one who found her hiding in a cave system 3 miles from town, trembling and unable to speak about what had frightened her so badly. He'd carried her home with a gentleness that had brought tears to her mother's eyes, and somehow, without anyone quite understanding how he'd done it, he'd managed to help the child overcome whatever terror had driven her to run. Emma had tried to discuss child psychology with him afterward, curious about his techniques, but once again he'd redirected the conversation away from anything that might reveal his background. The truth was that James Anderson carried secrets that weighed heavier than the Colorado mountains that surrounded their valley. He'd been Dr. James Anderson once, a military physician who had served in conflicts that hadn't yet found their way into the history books, places where the boundary between healing and killing had become dangerously blurred. He'd seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes, had made decisions that haunted his sleep, and had finally walked away from everything he'd known when the weight of it all became too much to bear. The ranch had been his attempt at redemption, a place where he could use his hands to build rather than repair the damage others had done. He raised cattle and horses, tended a garden that supplied vegetables to half the valley, and tried to convince himself that the peace he'd found in Millbrook Valley could somehow balance the scales of his past. Most days he almost believed it was working. The townspeople had grown comfortable with their enigmatic neighbor, incorporating him into their community in the way that small towns do, accepting his contributions while respecting his privacy. They trusted him to help with difficult births when Dr. Hayes was unavailable, to provide medical advice when minor injuries occurred, and to lend his strength during harvests and barn raisings. In return, they offered him the gift of belonging without demanding confession. This delicate balance had persisted for 3 years, creating a life that James had begun to think might actually constitute healing. He attended church services at both the Catholic and Protestant congregations, not from strong faith, but from a desire to be part of something larger than his own regrets. He participated in community events, contributed to the school's needs, and had even begun tentatively courting Rebecca Adams, the widow who ran the boarding house with quiet efficiency and unexpected humor. For the first time since he'd left his former life behind, James Anderson had started to believe that he might deserve happiness, that he might be able to build something positive from the ruins of his past. He'd been thinking about proposing to Rebecca, about perhaps starting a family, about putting down roots so deep that nothing could ever uproot them again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That was before the stranger arrived at his gate, carrying despair so profound that it threatened to shatter the careful peace he'd constructed around himself. The afternoon had been unremarkable until that moment. James had spent the day repairing fence line damaged by a late summer storm, work that required just enough concentration to keep darker thoughts at bay while allowing him to enjoy the simple satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. The weather had been changing throughout the day, with clouds building over the mountains in a way that promised the first serious rain of the season. He'd been looking forward to the evening, planning to clean up and ride into town for dinner with Rebecca and perhaps a quiet walk around Cedar Creek's small downtown area. These simple pleasures had become precious to him, evidence that he was capable of living a normal life, despite everything that had come before. When he first saw the figure approaching his gate, James had assumed it was one of the neighbor children taking a shortcut home from school. The person was small enough and moved with enough uncertainty that it seemed the most logical explanation. It wasn't until he'd gotten closer that he realized his mistake. The woman who stood swaying at his fence was clearly in the final stages of physical and emotional exhaustion. Her clothes, once of good quality, were now torn and stained with the evidence of hard travel. Her shoes were worn through in places, suggesting she'd walked considerable distances. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and fatigue, with dark circles under eyes that seemed to stare at something far beyond what anyone else could see. When she collapsed against his fence post, James felt the familiar surge of medical training taking over. His first instinct was to assess her condition, to determine whether she needed immediate care for physical injuries or illness. But when she looked up at him and spoke those devastating words, he realized that her wounds went far deeper than anything he could treat with bandages or medication. "Please, just kill me now." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything James had tried to become. Here was suffering so profound that death seemed preferable to continuation, despair so complete that a stranger's mercy appeared to be the only remaining hope. It was exactly the kind of situation that had driven him from his former life, the impossible choice between healing and harm that had haunted too many of his nights. But something in her voice, perhaps the very quietness of her request, touched a part of James that had been buried under years of trying to forget. This wasn't a dramatic plea of someone seeking attention or the angry demand of someone looking to hurt others. This was the whispered prayer of someone who had simply reached the end of what she could endure. Instead of the clinical assessment that his training demanded, instead of the careful distance that his self-preservation required, James Anderson found himself responding from a place he'd thought was permanently closed off. He knelt beside her in the mud, heedless of his clean clothes, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Not today," he said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. "Today you rest." What Catherine Sullivan heard in those simple words would puzzle her for weeks to come. There had been no judgment in his tone, no false comfort, no attempt to minimize her pain or convince her that things would magically improve. Instead, there had been something she hadn't heard in so long that she'd almost forgotten it existed. The sound of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply refusing to abandon another person to their darkness. James helped her to her feet with a gentleness that spoke of extensive experience with fragile things, and guided her toward his house without asking questions that she clearly wasn't ready to answer. In that moment, neither of them could have imagined that this simple act of refusing to give up on a stranger would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just their own lives, but the entire character of Millbrook Valley. The rain began to fall in earnest as they reached his porch, as if the sky itself was acknowledging that something significant had just begun. The first 3 days passed in a haze of careful silence and tentative healing. Catherine Sullivan slept for nearly 18 hours straight in the small guest room that James had prepared, waking only when thunder from the autumn storm rattled the windows hard enough to shake her from whatever dreams or nightmares had claimed her. When she finally emerged, moving like someone testing whether the ground would hold her weight, James was waiting with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs prepared exactly the way his mother used to make them during the difficult times. After his father's death, he didn't ask questions. Experience had taught him that stories emerged in their own time, when the person carrying them felt safe enough to set down their burden. Instead, he offered practical comfort. Clean clothes that had belonged to his late sister, soap that smelled of lavender instead of harsh lye, a room where she could close the door and know that no one would enter without permission. These were small gestures, but Catherine received them with the wonder of someone who had forgotten that kindness existed without expectation of payment. Mary Chun was the first person in Cedar Creek to learn about the stranger at the Anderson place. She'd arrived at the ranch on Thursday morning with a delivery of supplies that James had ordered the previous week, expecting to find him working in his usual methodical way around the property. Instead, she discovered him sitting on his front porch in the middle of the morning, something she'd never seen him do in 3 years of knowing him. "You feeling poorly, Mr. Anderson?" Mary had asked, genuinely concerned. James was the most reliable customer she had, always predictable in his routines and his needs. "Got a guest," James had replied simply, nodding toward the house. "Someone who needs quiet for a while." Mary's English had improved dramatically since her family's arrival in Colorado, but she still thought more clearly in Cantonese when processing complex social situations. Something in James's tone suggested that this wasn't a casual visit from a distant relative or traveling acquaintance. This was something more serious, more fragile. "Guests need medicine?" she asked carefully. "My father knows herbs, old country remedies that help when Western doctors cannot." James had considered this offer with the same careful attention he gave to all decisions involving other people's welfare. Might be that would help eventually. Right now, mostly she needs to know she's safe. The pronoun revealed more than James had probably intended. A woman traveling alone to seek help from a man she didn't know suggested circumstances that Mary's practical mind could easily imagine, none of them pleasant. She'd nodded and completed her delivery without further questions, but she'd made mental notes about items that might be useful for someone recovering from trauma and hardship. Dr. Benjamin Hayes encountered Catherine for the first time on Friday afternoon, when James brought her to town for what he described as a general health assessment. Hayes had learned to read between the lines of James's requests over the past 3 years, understanding that his neighbor's medical background allowed him to identify problems that required professional attention while being too discreet to specify their exact nature. The woman who accompanied James into Hayes's office moved like someone expecting pain at any moment. She was clean and properly dressed, but there was something in her posture that reminded the doctor of wounded animals he'd treated, creatures who had learned that survival meant constant vigilance. Her handshake was firm enough to be polite, but brief enough to avoid prolonged contact, and her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging exits and potential threats with an efficiency that spoke of recent necessity. "Miss Sullivan is recovering from some difficult travel," James explained, using a tone that Hayes recognized as carefully neutral. "I thought it would be wise to ensure that she's physically well before she continues on her journey." Hayes conducted his examination with the same gentle professionalism he'd developed over 20 years of frontier medicine. Catherine answered his questions with monosyllabic responses that provided necessary information, without revealing anything personal. She was undernourished but not dangerously so, dehydrated but recovering, and showed evidence of recent physical stress that could have resulted from either illness or circumstances she wasn't prepared to discuss. What concerned Hayes most was what he didn't find. There were no obvious signs of violence, no injuries that suggested recent assault, nothing that would explain the bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her like heat from a fever. This was someone who had been damaged by experiences rather than events, worn down by prolonged exposure to something that had left no visible scars. "Physically, she's going to recover completely," Hayes told James privately while Catherine waited outside. "But I suspect you already knew that. What she needs isn't medical treatment." "No," James agreed quietly. "It isn't." Hayes studied his colleague with the curiosity that came from, Years of trying to understand the intersection between physical and emotional healing. You have experience with this kind of situation? Some, James replied, and Hayes knew better than to push for details that wouldn't be forthcoming. Father Miguel Santos was conducting evening prayers at St. Mary's when he noticed the unfamiliar figure sitting in the back pew. The woman appeared to be listening to the service, but her attention seemed focused on something beyond the words he was speaking. When he approached her afterward, she startled like someone waking from deep thought. "I hope you found some peace here tonight," he said gently, recognizing the signs of someone carrying burdens too heavy for easy conversation. "I found quiet," Catherine replied, and Santos understood that sometimes quiet was the most that could be hoped for. "You're welcome here whenever you need that quiet," he offered, and was surprised to see tears begin to form in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and Santos realized that she might not have heard those words in longer than anyone should have to endure. Emma Rodriguez encountered Catherine at Mary Chun's store on Saturday morning, where the stranger was methodically purchasing items from a list written in neat handwriting that suggested education and careful planning. Emma had developed a teacher's instinct for recognizing people who were struggling with circumstances beyond their control, and something about Catherine's deliberate movements and careful politeness suggested someone working very hard to appear normal. "You're staying with James Anderson," Emma observed, not as a question but as a way of opening conversation. "Temporarily," Catherine confirmed, her tone polite but not encouraging further discussion. Emma had worked with enough traumatized children to recognize the signs of someone who had learned to protect themselves through minimal engagement. "He's a good man. The whole community trusts him." "So I'm learning," Catherine replied, and Emma caught a note of surprise in her voice, as if trustworthiness was something she'd forgotten existed. "If you need anything while you're here," Emma offered carefully, "anything that might be easier to discuss with another woman, I'm usually at the schoolhouse during the day." Catherine had nodded her thanks, but Emma sensed that she was filing away the information rather than dismissing it. Sometimes people needed to know that help was available long before they were ready to accept it. Sheriff William Tucker became aware of the situation on Sunday, when James appeared at his office with a request that was both simple and complicated. He wanted to report that he was providing temporary assistance to a woman in distress, ensuring that her presence in the community was properly documented should anyone come looking for her, with less than honorable intentions. "Anyone I should be watching for specifically?" Tucker asked, understanding the subtext of James's careful phrasing. "Don't know yet," James admitted. "Might be no one. Might be someone. Seemed prudent to let you know the situation." Tucker appreciated this kind of practical communication. "She running from something or someone?" "Haven't asked," James replied, and Tucker nodded his understanding. Sometimes it was better to let people volunteer information when they felt ready to trust it with another person. "You need any official support with this?" Tucker offered. "Not yet. Maybe not at all. But it's good to know the option exists." Tucker had dealt with enough domestic situations over the years to understand that women sometimes needed to disappear from their previous lives for reasons that had nothing to do with criminal activity and everything to do with survival. "My door's open if circumstances change." By the end of Catherine's first week in Millbrook Valley, word had spread through Cedar Creek with the efficiency that characterized small communities. Everyone knew that James Anderson was helping a woman who'd arrived under difficult circumstances. Everyone understood that she needed privacy and kindness rather than curiosity and gossip. Everyone watched discreetly to ensure that she felt welcome without being overwhelmed by attention. The unspoken consensus was that Catherine Sullivan was someone worthy of protection, and the community quietly arranged itself around providing that protection. Mary Chun made sure that her store visits occurred during quieter hours when she wouldn't have to navigate crowds or unwanted questions. Dr. Hayes let it be known that anyone bothering his patient would have to answer to him personally. Emma Rodriguez positioned herself as an available resource without being pushy about offering help. Father Santos included prayers for travelers and refugees in his services, speaking generally but meaningfully about the community's responsibility to care for those seeking sanctuary. This collective response revealed something about Cedar Creek that might not have been obvious under normal circumstances. Despite their isolation and the challenges of frontier life, these people had maintained a fundamental decency that expressed itself through practical action rather than empty sentiment. They understood instinctively that healing required both safety and dignity, and they provided both without expecting gratitude or explanation in return. Catherine began to notice these small kindnesses during her second week in town. The way conversations would shift to include her without demanding participation. The way prices at the store seemed slightly lower than the amounts written on her careful shopping lists. The way people nodded politely when they encountered her on the street, acknowledging her presence without staring or whispering afterward. These gestures accumulated like snowflakes, individually insignificant, but collectively creating something that began to resemble hope. She started helping James with ranch work, initially as a way of earning her keep, but gradually because the physical activity provided a kind of therapy that no amount of talking could have achieved. Feeding livestock, mending fences, and tending the garden required just enough concentration to keep darker thoughts at bay while providing tangible evidence that she was capable of contributing something positive to the world. James watched her careful movements around the animals with interest, noting how she seemed to understand their needs intuitively and how they responded to her with unusual trust. When he mentioned this observation, Catherine had smiled for the first time since her arrival. "My father raised horses before," she began, then stopped herself from completing the sentence. "Before whatever happened that brought you here," James finished gently, and Catherine nodded her appreciation that he didn't push for details she wasn't ready to share. "I used to think I'd spend my life working with animals," she admitted. "Seemed simpler than people." "Animals don't lie," James agreed. "But they don't forgive the way people can either." This conversation marked a turning point in Catherine's recovery, though neither of them recognized it at the time. She'd revealed something about her past voluntarily, and James had received it without judgment or demands for additional information. The exchange established a pattern of gradual disclosure that would continue over the following weeks, allowing Catherine to reconstruct her story at her own pace while feeling heard rather than interrogated. Her nightmares began to diminish during the third week, replaced by sleep that actually provided rest instead of simply marking time until dawn. James, who had his own experience with trauma-induced insomnia, recognized the significance of this improvement without commenting on it directly. Instead, he began leaving small projects for her to discover, tasks that would provide a sense of purpose without being overwhelming. Catherine found herself looking forward to these challenges, whether it was training a young horse that had been mistreated by its previous owner, or organizing the medical supplies that James kept in, quantities that seemed excessive for a simple rancher. Each completed task restored a small portion of her confidence, proving that she remained capable of useful work despite everything that had happened. The community continued to watch and wait, providing support through presence rather than pressure. Rebecca Adams invited Catherine to join the Women's Sewing Circle, an offer that was politely declined but appreciated. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell made a point of stopping by the Anderson place during their weekly rides to town, ostensibly to check on James's cattle, but actually to demonstrate that Catherine was becoming part of their extended social network. Even the children seemed to understand that this stranger needed special consideration. When Catherine encountered them during her trips to town, they offered shy smiles and careful politeness instead of the bold curiosity that usually characterized their interactions with adults. Emma Rodriguez had spoken with her students about the importance of making newcomers feel welcome, and they had internalized the lesson with the earnestness that made childhood such a powerful force for good. By the end of her third week in Millbrook Valley, Catherine Sullivan had begun to believe that perhaps she deserved the kindness she was receiving. The constant vigilance that had characterized her first days was gradually being replaced by something that resembled trust, not just in James Anderson but in the community that had accepted her without demanding explanations she wasn't ready to provide. She still hadn't told anyone the full story of what had brought her to James's gate that rainy evening, but she'd begun to think that perhaps someday she would be able to share that burden with people who had proven themselves worthy of receiving it. For now it was enough to wake up each morning without immediately wishing she hadn't, to find small pleasures in daily routines, and to discover that healing was possible even when it seemed like the last thing she deserved. The first real test of her newfound stability was approaching, though none of them knew it yet. Word had begun to spread beyond Millbrook Valley about the woman who had found sanctuary with James Anderson, and not everyone who heard those stories had benevolent intentions. The past that Catherine was trying so hard to leave behind was about to catch up with her, and the community that had embraced her was about to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect someone they had chosen to call their own. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October, delivered by a nervous young writer who seemed eager to complete his business and depart quickly. Sheriff Tucker read it twice before walking across the street to the general store, where he found Mary Chun restocking shelves with winter supplies that had arrived on the morning wagon. "Need to have a word with James," Tucker said quietly, folding the telegram carefully. "Private matter." Mary nodded, understanding immediately that this wasn't casual conversation. She'd lived through enough upheavals in her own life to recognize the kind of tension that preceded difficult revelations. He was here earlier for supplies. Mentioned checking fence line on the north pasture today. Tucker found James exactly where Mary had predicted, methodically replacing posts that had been damaged by an early snowfall the previous week. Catherine was working nearby, her movements efficient as she sorted salvageable materials from those that needed replacement. The domestic normalcy of the scene made what Tucker had to share feel even more intrusive. "Got a message came through the territorial office," Tucker began without preamble. "Inquiry about a woman matching Catherine's description. Party claims to be family, concerned about her welfare." James set down his hammer with deliberate care, his expression neutral, but his body language shifting to something more alert. Catherine stopped working entirely, her face pale as understanding began to register. "What kind of inquiry?" James asked. Tucker unfolded the telegram and read aloud, seeking information about Catherine Marie Sullivan. Age 24, brown hair, green eyes, last seen traveling west from Kansas. Family concerned for her safety. Please contact Franklin Blackwood, attorney, Dodge City, Kansas, with any information regarding her whereabouts. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees that marked the property boundary. Catherine's hands had begun to tremble, and she gripped the fence rail with enough force that her knuckles showed white beneath the skin. "Family," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "That's what he's calling himself now." James moved closer to her, his presence offering stability without crowding her space. "You know this Blackwood?" Catherine's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Franklin Blackwood is my late husband's business partner. The man who convinced Edward that I was having affairs, that I was stealing money, that I was responsible for every failure of their investment schemes." She looked directly at Tucker, her green eyes reflecting a combination of fear and anger that the sheriff found deeply unsettling. "He's also the man who tried to have me committed to an asylum when I threatened to expose their business practices to the territorial authorities." Tucker absorbed this information with the careful attention he'd learned to apply to complicated legal situations. "Tried to have you committed?" "Edward died in a carriage accident 6 months ago," Catherine explained, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "The night before he was supposed to testify about irregularities in their mining investments." Very convenient timing. She released her grip on the fence rail and faced both men directly. Franklin inherited Edward's share of the business and discovered that I knew about the falsified assay reports, the bribes to territorial officials, the funds that disappeared from investors' accounts. James listened without interruption, his medical training helping him assess both the physical signs of Catherine's stress and the logical consistency of her account. Everything she was describing aligned with his observations of her behavior during the past month. The hypervigilance and carefully controlled responses of someone who had learned that powerful people could manipulate systems to their advantage. "So you ran," Tucker said, and Catherine nodded. "After Franklin paid 3 doctors to declare me mentally unstable without ever examining me. After he had my bank accounts frozen and my personal belongings seized as evidence of my supposed theft." Catherine's composure began to crack slightly, revealing the exhaustion that lived beneath her careful control. "I managed to escape with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and what little money I could borrow from our housekeeper. I've been traveling for 2 months, staying ahead of the private investigators he hired to bring me back." Tucker exchanged glances with James, both men recognizing the seriousness of what they were hearing. This wasn't a simple domestic dispute or family disagreement. This was a sophisticated campaign of harassment and manipulation by someone with enough resources to bend legal systems to his will. "What happens if he finds you?" James asked quietly. Catherine's answer came without hesitation. "He'll have me declared incompetent and committed to whatever institution will accept his payment. Once I'm locked away, he'll have permanent control of Edward's assets and no one left who can testify about their criminal activities." She looked at Tucker with desperate intensity. "Sheriff, I know how this sounds. I know it seems like the kind of story that unstable women tell to justify running away from their responsibilities. But I can prove everything I've told you." She reached into her coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that Tucker hadn't noticed before, handling it with the care reserved for precious objects. Edward kept copies of everything, hidden in a place that Franklin doesn't know about. Financial records, correspondence with territorial officials, documentation of bribes and falsified reports. I took them when I realized what Franklin was planning to do to me. James examined the documents that Catherine spread across the fence rail, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. The papers told a story of systematic corruption involving multiple mining operations, territorial land offices, and at least 3 judges who had accepted payments in exchange for favorable rulings. "This is evidence of major territorial crimes," Tucker observed, understanding now why Catherine had been traveling with such desperate urgency. "These documents could bring down half the territorial government in Kansas. Which is exactly why Franklin can't afford to let me live free long enough to present them to honest authorities," Catherine replied. "He's convinced everyone in Dodge City that I'm mentally unstable, that any accusations I make are the delusions of a grieving widow who can't accept her husband's death." Tucker carefully refolded the telegram and placed it in his pocket, his mind already working through the implications of what he'd learned. "How long do you think it will take him to track you here?" "He's had investigators working for weeks," Catherine admitted. "They've been following my trail through every town where I stopped for supplies or shelter. I'd estimate he knows I'm in Colorado by now, possibly even that I'm in this general area." James had been listening while mentally cataloging the defensive advantages and disadvantages of the ranch's location. "We need to assume he'll find this place within days rather than weeks." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. All 3 turned to see Emma Rodriguez and Dr. Hayes riding up the main road, their expressions suggesting they had news of their own to share. "Sheriff Tucker," Emma called as soon as they were within speaking distance. "We've been looking for you. There are strangers in town asking questions about Catherine." Hayes dismounted and approached the group with the urgency of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. 3 men arrived an hour ago, claiming to be federal marshals looking for a woman wanted for theft and fraud. They're showing people a photograph and offering reward money for information about her location. Catherine swayed on her feet as if she'd been physically struck. Federal marshals? They don't look like any federal marshals I've ever seen, Emma said grimly. Too well-dressed, too polite, and they're paying for information with silver dollars instead of relying on civic duty. Mary Chun sent Danny O'Brien to find us as soon as they left her store. Tucker's jaw tightened with anger. Blackwood's moving faster than we expected. He's probably bribed someone to create false federal warrants. James made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. Then we make our stand here. James, Catherine protested, you don't understand what you're up against. Franklin Blackwood has enough money to buy whatever legal authority he needs. He can make federal marshals real if he wants them to be real. Maybe in Kansas, James replied, his voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been present moments before. But this is Colorado, and these people aren't going to let him walk into their community and steal someone they've chosen to protect. Tucker nodded slowly, understanding the shift that was occurring in the conversation. You're talking about making this an official matter. I'm talking about doing what's right, James corrected. Catherine has evidence of territorial crimes. She deserves the chance to present that evidence to legitimate authorities instead of being silenced by corrupt ones. Dr. Hayes had been examining the documents while listening to the conversation. This level of corruption would be of significant interest to federal authorities who aren't connected to Kansas territorial politics. The U.S. Marshal Service has been investigating mining fraud throughout the Western Territories. Emma's teacher training had given her experience with bureaucratic systems and their vulnerabilities. If we can get Catherine to Denver, to the federal courthouse there, she might be able to present her evidence to people who can't be bought by Blackwood's money. That's a 2-day ride under good conditions, Tucker observed. And these fake marshals will be watching every road out of the valley. Catherine looked at each of them with an expression that combined gratitude with disbelief. You're all talking about risking your lives to protect someone you barely know, someone who's brought danger to your community just by being here. You're not someone we barely know, Emma replied firmly. You're Catherine Sullivan, and you've been part of this community for a month. We protect our own. James nodded his agreement. Besides, what kind of people would we be if we let corruption triumph, just because fighting it involves personal risk? The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Sheriff Tucker immediately positioned himself between the newcomers and Catherine, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. 3 well-dressed men rode into view, their horses and equipment clearly indicating significant financial resources. The leader dismounted with practiced authority, his badge visible on his coat lapel. Sheriff Tucker. Deputy Marshal Harrison, Federal Service. We're looking for a woman named Catherine Sullivan, wanted for theft and fraud in Kansas Territory. We have information suggesting she may be in this area. Tucker studied the badge with professional interest, noting details that confirmed his suspicions about its authenticity. May I see your warrant, Marshal? Harrison handed over a document that appeared official at first glance, but contained subtle errors that Tucker's experience allowed him to identify. The paper was too new, the signatures too perfect, and the legal language included phrases that weren't typically used in federal warrants. This warrant was issued in Kansas Territorial Court, Tucker observed. Federal marshals typically operate under federal warrants from federal courts. Harrison's composure faltered slightly. Territorial Cooperation Agreement. The Federal Service assists local authorities when fugitives cross territorial boundaries. I'm sure they do, Tucker agreed pleasantly. Why don't you gentlemen accompany me to my office? I'd like to verify your credentials through proper channels before we proceed with any arrests. The tension in Harrison's posture was visible to everyone present. Sheriff, we have reason to believe the fugitive may be armed and dangerous. Time is of the essence in apprehending her before she can harm innocent people. James stepped forward, his demeanor calm but unmistakably protective. "The only woman on my property is my housekeeper, who's been working here for weeks. Perhaps you gentlemen have received inaccurate information." Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied James with increased attention. "And you are?" "James Anderson, owner of this ranch. These are my friends and neighbors, all respected members of our community." James's voice carried an undertone of steel that made it clear he wasn't intimidated by badges or authority claims. "If you have legitimate business here, you're welcome to conduct it properly. If you're here under false pretenses, you should leave immediately." The standoff continued for several long moments, with neither side willing to back down. Finally, Harrison remounted his horse with obvious reluctance. "We'll be back with proper territorial authority," he warned. "Interfering with federal law enforcement is a serious crime. So is impersonating federal officers," Tucker replied evenly. "I'll be sending telegrams to verify your credentials as soon as you leave my jurisdiction." As the three men rode away, Catherine emerged from behind the fence where she'd been concealed during the confrontation. "They'll be back with more men and better forged documents," she said quietly. "Franklin doesn't accept defeat easily." "Neither do we," James replied. And Catherine realized that something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of her situation. She was no longer a lone fugitive trying to evade pursuit. She had become part of something larger, a community that had decided her fight was their fight. The battle for Catherine's freedom was about to begin in earnest, and the people of Millbrook Valley were preparing to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect someone they had learned to call family. The emergency meeting convened at St. Mary's Church that evening, with representatives from every family in Cedar Creek gathered in the flickering light of oil lamps and candles. Father Santos had offered the space without hesitation, understanding that some conversations required the sanctuary that sacred ground could provide. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of more people than they usually held. Farmers and shopkeepers sitting beside teachers and craftsmen, united by a common purpose that transcended their usual social divisions. Sheriff Tucker stood at the altar, the forged warrant spread on the lectern beside Catherine's evidence portfolio. The contrast between the two sets of documents told its own story about the nature of the conflict they were facing. On one side lay crude forgeries backed by corrupt money. On the other sat meticulous records of criminal activity that could reshape territorial politics if they reached honest authorities. "Franklin Blackwood has resources we can't match," Tucker began without preamble. "Money enough to buy false documents, hire private armies, and corrupt officials across multiple territories. What he doesn't have is what we possess in abundance." He gestured toward the assembled crowd. "People who know the difference between right and wrong, and who aren't afraid to act on that knowledge." Thomas Mitchell, the eldest farmer in the valley, stood with the careful deliberation of someone whose words carried weight among his neighbors. "Sheriff, we've all heard Catherine's story, seen her evidence, watched how she conducts herself. But we need to understand exactly what we're committing ourselves to if we decide to protect her." "You're committing to a fight that could last months," Catherine replied before Tucker could respond. She stood near the front of the church, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that had returned with the day's revelations. "Franklin won't stop with fake marshals. He'll bring real territorial authorities who owe him favors. He'll offer bribes to anyone who might be tempted. He'll make life difficult for every person who stands in his way." Rebecca Adams raised her hand to speak, her voice carrying the practical authority of someone who had managed complex business operations. "Catherine, what you're describing sounds like war. Economic war against people who make their living from farming and small business. Can we sustain that kind of pressure?" "The question isn't whether we can sustain it," Mary Chun interjected, her accented English lending gravity to her words. "Question is whether we can live with ourselves if we don't try. My family came here because we believed America was a place where honest people could build honest lives. If we let corruption win because fighting is difficult, What does that say about who we are?" Dr. Hayes stood and addressed the assembly with the measured tone he used for serious diagnoses. "I've examined Catherine's evidence extensively. The level of fraud documented in those papers represents theft from hundreds of investors, manipulation of territorial land surveys, and systematic bribery of government officials. This isn't just about protecting one woman. It's about exposing criminal activity that affects every honest citizen in the Western Territories." Emma Rodriguez had been taking notes throughout the discussion, her teacher's instincts for organization asserting themselves even in crisis situations. "We need to think strategically about this. What are our advantages? What resources do we have that Blackwood can't simply purchase?" James answered from his position near Catherine, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had planned military operations under difficult conditions. "We have knowledge of local terrain that his hired men lack. We have established relationships with honest officials in other territories who can't be bought. Most importantly, we have the truth, and we have each other." "That sounds inspiring," observed Judge Henry Coleman, who happened to be in town for the monthly circuit court session. "But inspiration doesn't stop bullets or legal proceedings initiated by corrupt territorial authorities. If you're serious about protecting Catherine and ensuring her evidence reaches federal authorities, you need concrete plans, not noble sentiments." Father Santos spoke for the first time since offering the church for their meeting. "Judge Coleman raises valid concerns, but he also offers us something invaluable. As a federal circuit judge, you have direct access to U.S. Marshal Services that operate independently of territorial politics." Coleman nodded slowly, understanding the implications of what was being suggested. "I could potentially arrange for Catherine to testify before a federal grand jury in Denver, assuming her evidence is as significant as Dr. Hayes suggests. But getting her to Denver safely would require coordination with federal authorities, and that process takes time we may not have." Danny O'Brien, who had been serving as an unofficial scout and messenger, stood up from the back pew where he'd been sitting with several other young men from the community. "Judge, what if she didn't have to travel to Denver? What if the federal authorities came here instead?" "Federal grand juries don't travel to small communities, son," Coleman replied gently. "But federal marshals do," Danny persisted. "Especially when they're investigating territorial corruption that might involve federal land grants and mining rights." Coleman's expression shifted as he considered this possibility. "You're suggesting we invite federal investigation of Blackwood's activities, using Catherine's evidence as justification?" "I'm suggesting we do what honest people have always done when faced with corruption," James said quietly. "We demand justice through proper channels, and we protect witnesses until that justice can be achieved." The discussion continued for another hour, with various community members contributing ideas, concerns, and commitments. Sarah Mitchell volunteered to coordinate food and supplies for any extended defense of the valley. Rebecca Adams offered her boarding house as temporary headquarters for planning activities. Mary Chun promised to use her family's connections with merchants in Denver to establish secure communication channels with federal authorities. As the meeting progressed, a consensus began to emerge that surprised Catherine with its unanimity. These people weren't just offering temporary shelter or reluctant assistance. They were choosing to make her fight their fight, accepting the risks and consequences that decision would entail. Pastor Jonathan Reed, who had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, finally stood to address the assembly. "Friends, we're talking about taking a stand that could bring violence to our peaceful community. We're discussing actions that could result in economic hardship for families who have worked years to build their livelihoods. Before we commit ourselves to this path, we need to be certain that we're acting from conviction rather than emotion." "Pastor Reed raises an important point," Tucker acknowledged. "This decision needs to be made by every family independently, based on their own circumstances and consciences. No one should feel pressured to participate in something they believe is too dangerous for their situation." Catherine stood again, her voice stronger than it had been at any point since her arrival in Millbrook Valley. "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly. I never asked for your protection, and I'm not asking for it now. If this community decides that harboring me places too much risk on innocent families, I'll leave tonight and take my chances elsewhere. I won't have your children endangered because of my problems with Franklin Blackwood." The silence that followed her statement was broken by an unexpected source. 10-year-old Sally Tucker, Sheriff Tucker's daughter, stood up in the pew where she'd been sitting with several other children who had been brought to the meeting by parents who couldn't arrange childcare. "Miss Catherine," Sally said in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the church, "you helped me when I was scared and hiding in the caves. You sat with me and taught me that being afraid doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're paying attention. Now you're scared, and we want to help you the same way you helped me." The child's words seemed to crystallize something that had been building throughout the evening's discussion. One by one, families began to declare their commitment to protecting Catherine and ensuring that her evidence reached federal authorities. The Mitchells offered the use of their extensive property for defensive positions. The Chun family volunteered to serve as communication intermediaries with outside authorities. Dr. Hayes pledged his medical services for anyone injured in the coming conflict. Even families with young children found ways to contribute. The Rodriguez family offered their schoolhouse as a secure meeting location. The Adams family volunteered to coordinate logistics and supplies. The Santos family promised to maintain communication with religious authorities, who might provide additional support for refugees and witnesses. By the time the meeting concluded near midnight, Cedar Creek had transformed itself from a collection of individual families into something approaching a military organization. Work assignments had been distributed, communication protocols established, and defensive positions identified. Most importantly, a unanimous decision had been reached that Catherine's evidence must reach federal authorities, regardless of the personal cost to community members. As people began to file out of the church, Catherine found herself surrounded by individuals offering personal assurances of support. Mary Chun pressed a small bag of silver coins into her hands. "In case you need to travel quickly," she whispered. Emma Rodriguez gave her a leather satchel containing maps of Colorado Territory and contact information for trustworthy people in various towns. Dr. Hayes provided a medical kit and instructions for treating common injuries that might result from the coming conflict. James waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before approaching Catherine, who stood near the altar looking overwhelmed by the evening's developments. "I never expected this," she said quietly. "In Kansas, Franklin convinced everyone that I was mentally unstable, that my accusations were the delusions of a grieving widow. People who had known me for years suddenly treated me like a dangerous stranger." "You're not in Kansas anymore," James replied simply. "And these people have had a month to observe your character firsthand. They've seen how you work, how you treat others, how you conduct yourself under pressure. That kind of evidence carries more weight than any amount of money or political influence." Catherine looked around the empty church, still decorated with the remnants of their community meeting. "James, I need you to understand something. If we go through with this plan, if we try to get my evidence to federal authorities, Franklin will discover who helped me. He'll make life difficult for everyone in this valley, possibly for years to come. Are you prepared for that kind of sustained conflict?" James considered her question with the same careful attention he gave to all serious decisions. "Catherine, 6 months ago, I was a broken man hiding from his past, trying to convince himself that isolation was the same thing as healing. This community gave me a chance to become someone better than I was, someone useful instead of just haunted. If protecting you and exposing corruption is the price of that transformation, it's a price worth paying." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Catherine's eyes for the second time since her arrival in Millbrook Valley. "Why? Why are you willing to risk everything for someone you barely know?" Because that's what decent people do, James replied. And because I suspect that saving you might be the same thing as saving myself. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the church at considerable speed. Danny O'Brien burst through the doors, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Sheriff Tucker," he called, though Tucker had already stepped out of the shadows where he'd been waiting to ensure everyone departed safely. "Riders coming from the east. At least a dozen men, maybe more. They'll be here within the hour." Tucker's expression hardened as he processed this information. "Blackwood's moving faster than we anticipated. He must have additional resources positioned closer than we thought." James was already moving toward the door, his demeanor shifting to something more focused and dangerous. "Then we implement our defensive plans immediately. Catherine, you know these people better than we do. What should we expect from a dozen hired gunmen working for Franklin Blackwood?" Catherine's answer came without hesitation, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had learned to anticipate the worst from people with unlimited resources and flexible morals. "Expect them to be professionals who won't be discouraged by legal threats or community resistance. Expect them to use whatever force is necessary to achieve their objectives. And expect them to have been told that I'm mentally unstable and dangerous, which gives them justification for using lethal force if they encounter any resistance." The battle for Catherine's freedom was about to begin in earnest, and the people of Millbrook Valley were about to discover whether their commitment to justice was stronger than Franklin Blackwood's commitment to silencing the truth. The riders appeared through the mountain mist just before dawn, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky like harbingers of violence, seeking to disturb the peace of Millbrook Valley. Franklin Blackwood himself led the group, his expensive coat and gleaming boots marking him as someone accustomed to commanding others while avoiding personal risk. Behind him rode a collection of hired professionals whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the morning air. Catherine watched their approach from the window of the Anderson house, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd spent the night copying her evidence documents, creating multiple sets that could be hidden throughout the valley in case Blackwood's men succeeded in destroying the originals. The work had kept her hands busy while her mind processed the reality that these people she'd come to care about were preparing to risk everything for her freedom. James stood beside her, his own preparations complete. The house had been transformed into a fortress overnight, with furniture repositioned to provide defensive cover and weapons placed at strategic locations. More importantly, signal mirrors had been positioned to communicate with other defensive positions throughout the valley, ensuring that no part of Blackwood's force could move unobserved. "He brought more men than expected," Catherine observed, counting at least 15 riders approaching the ranch. "Franklin never liked leaving anything to chance." "Neither do we," James replied, indicating the subtle signs of preparation that only trained eyes would notice. Sheriff Tucker's men were already in position at concealed locations around the property, while other community members had taken up defensive positions along every road leading out of the valley. Blackwood halted his group 50 yards from the house, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to avoid immediate retaliation if negotiations failed. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and superior resources. "Catherine Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years commanding others. "You've caused considerable trouble with your theatrical flight across the territories. It's time to end this charade and return to Kansas, where you can receive proper medical attention for your obvious mental disturbance." Catherine stepped onto the porch, her posture straight and her voice clear as she responded. "Franklin Blackwood, you've traveled a long way to perpetuate the same lies you've been spreading in Kansas. The only charade here is your claim to be concerned about my welfare when your real interest is silencing my testimony about your criminal activities." Blackwood's facade of concerned civility slipped slightly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "My dear Catherine, Your husband's death has clearly affected your ability to think rationally. The documents you claim to possess are either forgeries created during your mental breakdown or legitimate business records that you've misinterpreted due to your lack of understanding about mining operations. Then you won't object to having them examined by federal authorities who specialize in territorial fraud. Catherine replied calmly, I'm sure they'll be able to determine their authenticity and significance. The tension in Blackwood's posture increased visibly as he realized that Catherine wasn't responding with the fear and confusion he'd expected. Something had changed during her time in Millbrook Valley, some fundamental shift that had transformed her from a desperate fugitive into someone prepared to stand and fight. Catherine, you're clearly being influenced by people who don't understand the complexities of your situation, Blackwood said, his tone becoming more threatening. These simple farmers and shopkeepers can't protect you from federal warrants or territorial authorities. Come with me now, and I'll ensure you receive the gentlest possible treatment during your recovery. James stepped onto the porch beside Catherine, his presence immediately altering the dynamics of the confrontation. Mr. Blackwood, Catherine Sullivan is under the protection of this community until such time as legitimate federal authorities can review her evidence and testimony. Your fake marshals and forged warrants carry no weight here. Blackwood studied James with increased attention, recognizing something in his bearing that suggested military training and combat experience. And you are? Someone who recognizes the difference between justice and persecution, James replied evenly. Someone who's seen enough corruption to know it when it appears in his community. The standoff continued for several minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Finally, Blackwood made his decision, signaling to his men with a subtle gesture that Catherine recognized from her months of observing his business practices. Take her, he ordered, abandoning any pretense of legal authority. Use whatever force is necessary. The battle that followed would be remembered in Millbrook Valley for generations to come, not because of its scale or duration, but because of what it revealed about the character of people who chose to stand against overwhelming odds rather than surrender to corruption. Blackwood's hired gunmen were professionals, experienced in violence and accustomed to intimidating civilians who lacked the training or equipment to resist effectively. What they encountered instead was a coordinated defense organized by people who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this confrontation. Sheriff Tucker's deputies emerged from concealed positions with military precision, their weapons trained on Blackwood's men from multiple angles. Community members armed with hunting rifles appeared on rooftops and behind defensive barriers, creating crossfires that made any aggressive movement extremely dangerous for the attackers. Most importantly, Judge Coleman appeared from the direction of town, accompanied by 3 genuine federal marshals who had arrived during the night in response to telegrams sent to Denver the previous week. The sound of their horses approaching caused both sides to pause their preparations for violence. Franklin Blackwood, Judge Coleman announced in the carrying voice he used for formal legal proceedings, you are under arrest on federal charges of territorial fraud, bribery of government officials, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. Federal Marshal Davidson will read you the specific charges. Blackwood's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this unexpected development. Surprise, anger, and finally desperate calculation as he realized that his carefully constructed plans had been anticipated and countered by people he'd underestimated. This is absurd, he protested. I'm here on legitimate business, attempting to return my business partner's mentally disturbed widow to proper medical care. These charges are obviously fabricated by people with grudges against successful businessmen. Marshal Davidson approached Blackwood with the calm authority of someone who had arrested hundreds of criminals over the course of his career. Mr. Blackwood, we've spent 3 weeks investigating the evidence provided by Mrs. Sullivan. We've also received corroborating testimony from territorial officials who were approached with bribery attempts, investors who were defrauded by falsified mining reports, and former associates who were threatened when they questioned your business practices. The revelation that federal authorities had been investigating Blackwood's activities for weeks rather than days seemed to drain the fight out of his hired men. Several immediately began distancing themselves from their employer, clearly unwilling to face federal charges for someone who had misrepresented the nature of their assignment. Catherine descended from the porch and approached Blackwood with a composure that reflected her transformation over the past 2 months. "Franklin, Edward kept records of everything. Every bribe, every falsified report, every threat made against people who questioned your methods. He was going to testify against you the day he died, and he made sure that someone else would be able to continue his work if anything happened to him." Blackwood's expression shifted to something approaching desperation as the full scope of his situation became clear. "Catherine, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. The people involved in these operations have resources that extend far beyond territorial boundaries. If you testify against them, you'll never be safe, no matter where you try to hide." "She won't be hiding," James interjected quietly. "She'll be living openly in a community that's already proven it's willing to protect people who stand up for what's right." The arrests were completed without further violence, though the process required several hours as federal authorities sorted through Blackwood's men, determining which ones had been aware of the criminal nature of their assignment and which had been deceived by false representations. Most were released after questioning, while a few who had participated knowingly in previous illegal activities were taken into custody. Catherine spent the afternoon providing detailed testimony to the federal marshals, walking them through the evidence she'd preserved and explaining the context of various documents and correspondence. The process was exhausting but liberating, finally allowing her to share the burden of knowledge she'd carried alone for months. As evening approached, the people of Cedar Creek gathered once again at St. Mary's Church, this time for a celebration rather than a strategic planning session. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but more importantly, they had proven to themselves that ordinary people working together could stand against corruption and intimidation when they chose to act on their convictions. Catherine found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and expressing hopes that she would choose to remain in Millbrook Valley permanently. The idea of staying, of building a life among people who had risked everything to protect her, was both appealing and intimidating after months of constant movement and uncertainty. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't stumbled onto your ranch that night," she told James as they stood together outside the church, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "You would have found somewhere else to rest," James replied with quiet confidence. "And eventually, you would have found the strength to fight back against Blackwood's persecution. What happened here just made the process faster and less lonely." Catherine considered this perspective, understanding that her own transformation had been as significant as the community's response to her crisis. "James, that night when I asked you to kill me, what did you see that made you refuse?" James thought carefully about his answer, recognizing the importance of the question. "I saw someone who had been hurt badly enough to believe that giving up was the only option left. But I also saw someone who had traveled hundreds of miles and overcome enormous obstacles to reach that moment. People who truly want to die don't fight that hard to stay alive." The insight struck Catherine with unexpected force, helping her understand something about her own journey that she hadn't been able to articulate before. "I wasn't really asking you to end my life. I was asking you to help me figure out how to keep living it." "That's what communities do," James replied. "They help people remember that survival is possible, that healing can happen, and that the future doesn't have to be limited by the worst things that have happened in the past." 6 months later, Catherine Sullivan and James Anderson were married in a ceremony that brought together people from across the Colorado Territory, including several federal officials who had worked on the case that resulted from Catherine's evidence. The wedding reception lasted until dawn, with music and dancing that celebrated not just a union between two people who had found healing together, but a community's commitment to protecting those who needed sanctuary. The corruption case that grew from Catherine's testimony, ultimately, resulted in prison sentences for more than a dozen territorial officials and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been stolen from legitimate investors. More importantly, it established precedents for federal oversight of territorial mining operations that would protect honest prospectors and settlers for decades to come. Catherine never forgot the moment when she had whispered those desperate words to a stranger in the gathering darkness, or the response that had shattered her despair and rebuilt her world around hope instead of fear. But she also never forgot that the real transformation had come not from being rescued by one person, but from being embraced by an entire community that chose to make her fight their fight. The ranch that James and Catherine built together became a place where other travelers in crisis could find shelter and support, continuing the cycle of healing that had begun with a simple refusal to abandon someone who had given up on herself. They discovered that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that communities built on such foundations can withstand any storm. Years later, when people asked Catherine about the secret to her remarkable recovery from such devastating circumstances, her answer was always the same. I learned that asking for help isn't the same as giving up, and that sometimes the people most capable of saving you are the ones you've never met before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.